Hi friends, in this video we will be checking some of the deadliest pandemics disease in the history. A pandemic comes when a disease becomes a global outbreak. The new coronavirus, COVID-19, is now considered to be a pandemic. The deadly virus affects people across the world. It forces nations to close their borders, encourages people to remain indoors, and tells businesses to suspend operations. However, this isn't the first time so many lives have been impacted by a pandemic. Let's see list of 10 deadliest pandemics in history. Leprosy, the Middle Ages. Leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, is a slow-growing bacterial disease that can cause nerve, skin, eye, and respiratory damage. Many diagnosed with the disease may have poor eyesight and weak muscle. For thousands of years, the disease has infected humans, but during the Middle Ages it was a pandemic in Europe. During this time about 19,000 leper houses were thought to have existed in Europe. There are still about 200,000 cases of leprosy a year, but medicine can now cure it. Russian flu, 1889 to 1890. Russian flu, also known as Asian flu, was a destructive influenza pandemic that killed nearly 1 million people worldwide. The disease began to spread in 1889, and was the largest influenza epidemic in the 19th century. This was also the first true outbreak observed in the bacteriological period. Initial cases were recorded in Central Asia, northwestern Canada, and Greenland. Within 4 months the influenza had spread across the northern hemisphere. The third cholera pandemic. The third cholera pandemic, that lasted from 1852 to 1860, was the largest of the 7 cholera outbreaks. Just like the first 2 pandemics, the third originated in India and spread throughout Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. Cholera had killed 23,000 people in Great Britain in 1854, the worst year. During the third cholera pandemic, about 1 million people lost their lives. Many deaths came from Russia, Chicago, Tokyo, Spain, Venezuela, and Brazil. Contaminated water was thought to be the cause of cholera. Smallpox, 1,520. The smallpox has been a threat in Europe, Asia, and Arabia for decades. 3 out of every 10 persons who were infected died. The first European explorers took the virus into the New World. The mortality rates were significantly higher for the people of Mexico and the United States. Several smallpox outbreaks were considered epidemics. Here we're going to think about the one that destroyed the Aztec Empire in 1520. In North and South America, smallpox took approximately 100 years to destroy about 90% of the native people. In Mexico the population fell from around 11 million to 1 million people. Centuries later, smallpox was the first epidemic virus prevented by a vaccine. In 1980, the World Health Organization announced a global eradication of smallpox. Antonine Plague. This is also one of the oldest and the deadliest pandemics in history. The Antonine Plague took place in 165 to 180 and in the end caused the deaths of around 5 million people. Following a battle with the Parthians, the Romans took the disease back with them. The epidemic began in Asia Minor, and then spread to Greece and Italy. For the next 2 decades, the Roman Empire saw an outbreak unlike anything they had ever experienced. They had seen about 2,000 deaths per day at the high point of the outbreak. It has been estimated to have destroyed 7 to 10% of the entire Roman Empire. While the ailment that afflicted these individuals is unknown, many experts assume it was a smallpox epidemic. Asian flu, 1957 to 58. The second major influenza pandemic in the 20th century was the 1957 Asian flu, alias the Japanese flu pandemic. The epidemic was responsible for more than 1 million deaths. The virus spread across China and neighboring areas at the beginning of the Asian flu pandemic. Months later the flu entered the United States and the United Kingdom. The United States had reported that nearly 70,000 deaths were related to the Asian flu. Finally, a vaccine was developed which helped to control the pandemic. The Great Plague, 1665 to 66. The Great Plague forced leaders to shut down all public entertainment and seal the sick at home to help prevent disease spread. Overall, London has lost around 15% of its population. It is estimated that the actual number exceeds 100,000. Once the plague appeared in a home, a red cross was drawn at the door with the words, "God have mercy on us." Afterwards, the dead bodies were collected and taken to a plague pit in a chariot. Black Death, 1347 to 1351. The Great Bubonic Plague, also known as the Black Death, in the mid-1300s was one of the most destructive pandemics in history. In the 1330s, a deadly epidemic of bubonic plague started in China. As China was one of the busiest trading nations, the disease quickly spread everywhere. The Black Death had arrived in Europe by 1347, after many infected ships docked at the port of Sicily. Only 5 years later, more than 20 million people in Europe were killed by the plague. It is generally assumed that the Black Death was caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Bites of infected rats and fleas transmit the disease to humans. The plague caused a fever along with buboes. The disease also created reddish spots that turned black on the skin, which is why it was called Black Death by others. The Third Plague Pandemic, 1855 to 1960. The Third Plague Pandemic in China began in 1855, during the Qing dynasty reign. Eventually this deadly bubonic plague spread through India and Hong Kong, killing at least 12 to 15 million people. With more than 10 million deaths, India suffered the most casualties. This was the third major bubonic plague epidemic to reach European society. In 1960, Third Plague Pandemic deaths fell to less than 200 per annum. The World Health Organization at the time announced that the disease was not present anymore. Spanish flu, 1918 to 1920. The worst flu pandemic in history started in 1918, infecting about 1/3 of the world's population, or around 500 million people. While figures differ, it is thought that about 50 million people, including nearly 700,000 Americans, were killed by the Spanish flu. In spring 1918, the first outbreak of influenza happened, and it was usually mild. The second outbreak was extremely infectious and hit the globe with a vengeance. Originally, Spanish flu was seen in Europe, the United States and Asia before spreading around the globe. Victims of the influenza died within hours and days of symptoms emerging. The average lifespan in the US had dropped by 12 years since the Spanish flu had been around for only a year. Due to overcrowding in public facilities, schools, private homes, and other buildings became temporary hospitals. Please stay at home to break the chain of coronavirus before it becomes more stronger. That's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Please comment down which is the worst disease and comment if we missed any worst pandemic. Like our video and share it with your friends.